The first trial began at dawn on day 2, though dawn was a generous word for it. There was no sun inside the simulation chambers, only a harsh orange glow that poured from vents in the ceiling to mimic the atmosphere of a volcanic moon. The air was thick and yellow, heavy with sulfur, and the temperature inside the chamber climbed past 140 degrees within the first hour. Every recruit wore a standard coalition heat suit, a thick layer of temperature-regulated fabric fitted to their species. The Draxari suits were massive and reinforced. The Pelhari suits were light and layered with cooling gel. The Kreth had moisture-sealed suits to keep their skin from drying out. The human suits were somewhere in the middle, basic models pulled from a general inventory because the Academy had never needed to order human-specific gear before. The objective was simple: cross the simulated volcanic terrain from one end to the other in 48 hours. Navigate lava fields, gas vents, unstable ground, and heat zones that could cook an unprotected body in minutes. Do not stop. Do not fall behind. Do not die. The Draxari moved first. They were built for punishment and they knew it. Their thick scales reflected heat naturally, and their massive legs carried them over broken ground like it was a flat road. They pushed ahead with loud confidence, growling encouragement to each other in their deep rumbling language. The Pelhari struggled from the start. Their hollow bones made them light and fast in normal conditions, but the heat pressed down on them like a weight. One Pelhari cadet stumbled within the first 3 hours and had to be helped up by Torin, who was barely managing to stay upright. The Kreth moved steadily but slowly, their cold blood working against them in the searing environment. One of the 2 Kreth recruits collapsed 6 hours in, overwhelmed by thermal stress. The medical team pulled the recruit out on a stretcher. The other Kreth kept going, but looked like every step cost something important. Katie and Danny walked. That was the only word for it. They did not charge ahead like the Draxari. They did not stumble like the Pelhari. They moved at a steady, even pace, one foot in front of the other, breathing through their suit filters and checking their gear every 30 minutes, like it was a Sunday hike through rough country. Vorath watched from the monitoring station above the simulation floor. He sat in a high-backed chair, with a nutrient drink in one hand, and 3 screens in front of him showing vital signs, location data, and live camera feeds. The humans were unremarkable on every screen. Average heart rate, average speed, average everything. Suit malfunction. Recruit 7. Cooling system offline. He leaned forward. The chamber temperature in her zone was 151 degrees. Without active cooling, a human body would start shutting down within the hour. He reached for the communication panel to call the medical team. On the camera feed, Katie stopped walking. She looked down at the blinking warning light on her chest panel. She tapped it twice. Nothing happened. She stood still for about 10 seconds, and Vorath watched her vital signs begin to climb. Heart rate up, core temperature rising. Then Katie unzipped the top half of her heat suit, pulled it down to her waist, and tied it there. She reached into her pack, pulled out a cloth, soaked it with water from her canteen, and wrapped it around her nose and mouth. She rolled her sleeves up, adjusted her pack straps, and started walking again. Vorath nearly dropped his drink. He radioed the medical team and told them to be ready for the female human's collapse. He said it was only a matter of time. He kept the channel open and watched. Katie kept walking. Her skin turned red. Sweat ran down her arms and dripped off her fingers. She squinted against the sulfur haze and adjusted her breathing to short, controlled bursts through the wet cloth. Danny slowed his pace to match hers without being asked. He stayed 2 steps behind her and to the right, close enough to catch her if she fell. She did not fall. She finished the course 17 minutes ahead of 2 Draxari recruits who had working equipment the entire time. When she reached the finish point, she sat down on a flat rock drank water from her canteen in slow, steady sips, and opened a ration pack. By the time Vorath came down from the monitoring station and crossed the floor to reach her, she was eating calmly, like she had just finished a long walk, and nothing more. Vorath stood over her and demanded to know how she survived without thermal protection. His voice was harder than usual, and Katie could hear something underneath the anger that sounded almost like confusion. Katie looked up at him, chewing slowly. She told him that summers in Montana got pretty hot too, and that this was a bit worse, but not by as much as he might think. She said the trick was to keep the airways wet, and not to fight the heat, but move with it. Danny, who had just reached the finish line himself, sat down next to her and laughed quietly. Danny shrugged and said Katie once worked a wildfire containment line for 14 hours straight in August, and only complained because they ran out of coffee. Vorath turned and walked away without another word. The second trial came 4 days later. This time the simulation was an ocean world, a deep dark sea, filled with crushing pressure zones, freezing currents, and bioluminescent predators that hunted by sensing electrical signals in the water. Recruits were given basic underwater breathing gear and dropped into the deep. The Kreth came alive. Water was their world, and the remaining Kreth recruit moved through the simulation like a blade through silk, fast, smooth, and completely at home. The Draxari sank like stones and struggled with the pressure. The Pelhari panicked in the darkness. Torin panicked worst of all. A sudden pressure shift caught the small Pelhari in a downcurrent and dragged Torin into a pitch-black underwater trench. Torin's communication unit shorted out. The monitoring team flagged it as a potential emergency, and Vorath's hand hovered over the extraction button. Before he could press it, Katie was already diving. She had seen Torin go under. She did not wait for orders or permission. She pulled a deep breath, adjusted her gear, and dove straight down into the trench. The cameras lost her in the darkness almost immediately. Her vital signs were the only proof she was still alive, and they showed a heart rate that was elevated but controlled. She was holding her breath and swimming blind. Nearly 4 minutes later, Katie surfaced in the extraction zone with Torin tucked under one arm. The small Pelhari was coughing and shaking, but alive. Katie pulled Torin onto the platform, checked for injuries with quick, practiced hands, and then sat back and breathed hard for about 30 seconds before giving Danny a thumbs-up signal from across the pool. Vorath pulled Katie aside after the exercise. His voice was low and tight. He told her that what she did was reckless, that she could have died in that trench, and that the extraction team was seconds away from pulling Torin out safely. Katie looked at him steadily and said that where she came from, you did not leave someone behind just because it was hard. She said 4 minutes was nothing. She said she used to hold her breath for fun in the lake behind her house as a kid. She said Torin was scared, and a scared person alone in the dark needed a hand, not a robot on a cable. Danny stood behind her and nodded once. Vorath held her gaze for a long moment, then turned away. That evening, Commander Lishonvel began attending the observation sessions personally. She had been reviewing the data from a distance, but now she sat in the monitoring room and watched the replay footage with all 4 of her hands folded in her lap. She started a secondary file on the human recruits. She labeled it Behavioral Anomalies, Requires Further Study. By the end of week 2, 3 recruits had washed out. 1 Kreth, 1 Pelhari, 1 Draxari who had taken a bad fall on the volcanic course and never recovered mentally. The remaining squad was 9 strong. Both humans were still standing. Vorath stopped calling their presence a waste of resources. He did not say why, but in the quiet of his office that night, he opened the human homeworld file again and read the entry for Earth one more time. Class 12 Deathworld. Extreme temperature variance, high gravity, predatory megafauna, toxic atmosphere fluctuations. Tectonic instability. Pathogenic microbial diversity rated beyond standard measurement scales. He closed the file slowly and sat in the dark for a long time. Penny's name was starting to appear in conversations where it did not used to belong. In the training halls, in the mess hall, in the quiet corridors of the upper barracks where senior cadets lived. People were talking about the human girl, and not all of them were laughing anymore. This was a problem for Vor Tannik. Vor was a fourth-year Dranaki cadet. He stood nearly 9 feet tall, and his bone plates were thicker and darker than most of his kind, a sign of old warrior blood. His family had sent sons and daughters to the Valorian Academy for 6 generations. His grandfather had fought in the Ketsarun border wars. His mother commanded a battle fleet. In Vor's world, strength was not something you developed overnight. It was something you were born with, something that ran through your bloodline like a river through stone. The idea that a human, a species his people considered barely worth noticing, was being allowed to train in the same halls where his ancestors had trained, filled Vor with a cold, steady anger. It was not the wild kind of anger that burns out quickly. It was the kind that sits in the chest and waits. Vor was smart enough not to act directly. The academy had rules about harassment, and Headmaster Torek Van had already shown that he was willing to protect the human girl. So Vor took a different approach. He started talking. He spoke to other senior cadets, quietly, in private. He framed his words carefully. He did not say anything that could be reported as a threat. He simply asked questions. Was it fair that a human, admitted by a system error, was being allowed to stay, while qualified applicants from real civilizations had been turned away? Was it right that the headmaster was bending the rules for one cadet? Was the academy lowering its standards? The questions spread. They were the kind of questions that sounded reasonable if you did not think about them too hard. And most people did not think about them too hard. Within 2 weeks, Fireteam Dusk was feeling the effects. Other teams began refusing to partner with them during joint exercises. Instructors who had been neutral toward Penny started grading her more harshly. A rumor appeared that the headmaster had secretly adjusted the difficulty settings for Penny's simulations, making them easier so she would score higher. The rumor was not true, but it was believable enough to stick. Ren felt the pressure first. His older sister, who served as a fleet officer in the Dranaki military, sent him a message warning him that his association with the human was being noticed by people who mattered. Do not forget what that name means. Ren read the message 3 times. Then he deleted it and went to training. Kale received similar pressure from his clutchmates back home. Ishkai society was built around the clutch, a group of siblings who were hatched together and who supported each other for life. Kale's clutchmates told him he was wasting his potential on a team that would never amount to anything. They told him to request a transfer. Kale listened to them, the way he always did, and then he went back to leaving ration bars outside Penny's door. Sila's situation was the most complicated. Her family had invested heavily in her career at the academy. A Velith political house did not send a daughter to Valorian for the education. They sent her for the connections, the reputation, the doors that would open after graduation. Sila's performance was not just her own. It was her family's investment. And that investment was losing value every day she was associated with the Error Girl. Sila did not pull away from Penny, but she became quieter. She stopped sitting with the team at meals. She trained alone in the evenings. The warmth that had begun to develop between her and Penny cooled, not because Sila wanted it to, but because the weight on her shoulders was becoming hard to carry. Penny saw all of this. She was not stupid. She knew that her presence was costing her teammates something, and she felt the guilt of it like a stone in her stomach. But she did not know how to fix it. She could not make herself stronger, or faster, or more impressive. She could only keep doing what she had been doing, learning, adapting, surviving. She started spending her nights in the simulation chambers. After the regular training day ended, she would go down to the basement level, where the older, less popular chambers were kept, and run combat scenarios until their hands shook and her vision blurred. She studied every species at the academy. She learned how Drenikai shifted their weight before a strike. She learned the range of a Veleth's telepathic field and the frequency at which it could be disrupted. She memorized the attack patterns of Gorath heavy fighters and the escape routes that Ishkai scouts preferred. The archivist watched her. It had been watching her since the beginning, tracking her progress with something that might have been curiosity, if an artificial intelligence could feel such a thing. Without being asked, it began providing her with advanced study materials, tactical manuals, species behavioral analyses, historical battle records. It loaded them onto her datapad during the night, so she would find them when she woke up. Penny did not question where the materials came from. She just used them. The breaking point arrived during the Academy's live combat tournament. It was a tradition that went back centuries. Cadets were paired against each other in supervised one-on-one matches, and the results were posted publicly for the entire Academy to see. The pairings were supposed to be random. They were not. Vor Tannik had spoken to the right people. Penny was matched against Dren Kor, a second-year Gorath cadet who stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder, weighed over 500 pounds, and had 4 arms, each one thick enough to crush a steel beam. The pairing was legal, but absurd. It was like matching a sparrow against a bear. Everyone expected Penny to forfeit. Forfeiting was allowed. It was even considered wise in situations where the outcome was obvious. No one would have blamed her. Penny walked into the arena. The fight lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of Penny dodging, rolling, sliding, and refusing to stay still. She could not hurt Dren Kor. His hide was too thick, his body too massive. But she could move, and she did. She used the rocky, uneven floor of the arena to her advantage, staying on terrain where his weight worked against him. She kept to his blind spots. She forced him to turn his enormous body again and again, burning his energy on movement instead of combat. She scored points on his sensor pads, small, precise touches that the scoring system counted, even though they would not have scratched his skin in a real fight. She did not win. When the timer ended, Dren Kor had more points. But the margin was small, far smaller than anyone had imagined possible. The arena went quiet when the final score appeared. A human had lasted 7 minutes against a Gorath in open combat. It had never happened before in the Academy's history. Not once in 400 years. Vor Tannik watched from the upper stands. His face did not change, but his hands, hidden beneath his folded arms, had curled into fists. That night, Vor found Penny in a maintenance corridor on the lower level. He had checked the camera coverage beforehand. There were none here. He brought 2 of his followers, both senior Drenaki, both large enough to block the corridor with their bodies. Vor looked down at Penny. She looked up at him. The top of her head did not reach his chest. "You are a stain on this academy," Vor said. His voice was calm and even, the way a blade is calm and even. "You were let in by a broken machine, and you have been kept here by a foolish old man. You do not belong among warriors. You do not belong among soldiers. You do not belong here." He leaned closer. "Before something happens that cannot be undone." Penny's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Vor's bone plates could crack her skull with a casual swing. His followers were close enough that she could feel the heat coming off their bodies. Every survival instinct she had was screaming at her to run, to submit, to make herself small. She looked Vor in the eyes. "No," she said. Vor held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, his followers falling in behind him. Their footsteps echoed down the corridor like distant thunder. Penny stood alone in the dark hallway. Her hands were shaking. Her legs felt like they might give out. She leaned against the wall and breathed until the shaking stopped. The next morning, she reported the encounter to Commander Lyra Sorvain. Lyra listened, her silver face expressionless, and then told Penny that without evidence, she could not act on the accusation. She suggested that Penny consider whether her continued presence was worth the trouble it was causing. Penny left the office without a word. That evening, she told her fire team what had happened. The reaction was immediate. Ren stood up. His bone plates flared outward, a Dranaki sign of protective aggression that was as old as their species. "He has no honor," Ren said. It was the most words he had spoken in a single sentence since Penny had met him. Saiwa's eyes narrowed. "I will contact my family. There are political channels that can be used." Kale said nothing. But the next morning, Penny noticed he had started carrying a second blade. Something had changed. Fireteam Dusk was no longer just 4 cadets assigned to the same squad by an administrative system. Something that had been forged in the heat of shared struggle and hardened by the pressure that Vor Tannik had tried to use to break them apart. They were a team, and they were angry. Week 8 brought the Crucible, and the word alone was enough to make the barracks go quiet the night before. Vorath explained it during the final briefing with his usual flat voice, though Katie noticed he looked at the humans differently now. Not with respect exactly, but with something close to caution, the way a person looks at a river they once thought was shallow and now understood was deep. The Crucible was a single continuous 72-hour field operation that combined every element of the previous trials into one scenario. The remaining 7 recruits would be dropped together onto a Deathworld simulation island. The island had hostile predators, extreme weather shifts that cycled between burning heat and freezing cold every 12 hours, limited supplies, and an opposing force of Academy combat drones programmed to hunt, track, and eliminate anyone they found. The squad had to cross the island and reach an extraction point on the far side within the 72-hour window. Everyone had to make it. If even one recruit failed to reach the extraction point, the entire squad failed. Vorath said this once and did not repeat it. He looked around the room and his gaze stopped briefly on Katie. She was sitting in the back row with her arms crossed, listening. Danny sat next to her and Torrens sat on her other side, the small Pelhari pressed close like a bird sheltering from wind. The drop was rough. The shuttle released them onto a rocky ridge at the northern end of the island, and within seconds, the heat hit them like a wall. The simulation was set to a burning cycle. The ground shimmered. The air tasted like copper. They gathered in a loose group and looked at each other. 7 of them. 4 Draxari, including Gren. 1 Kreth, Torin, Kaylee, Danny. Nobody spoke. Then Gren stepped forward. He was the biggest Draxari left in the squad, and he had been quieter since his collapse in the jungle trial, but there was still a hard edge to him that had not gone away. He planted his feet, drew himself up to his full height, and announced that he would lead the squad across the island. He said the Crucible required a warrior's instinct and a warrior's strength, and he was the strongest one standing. Then he looked directly at Kaylee, and said that a human had no business leading warriors. The other Draxari shifted behind him. The Kreth said nothing. Torin's feathered crest pressed flat against the small Pelhari's skull. Kaylee looked at Gren for a long, quiet moment. She did not raise her voice, or puff up, or try to match his size. She just looked at him, the way someone looks at weather they cannot change, and said, "Fine." She told him to lead then, and to get them all across the island alive. Gren took point. He chose a route down the ridge and into a narrow ravine that cut through the center of the island. It looked like a shortcut. It looked sheltered from the heat. It looked, from the top of the ridge, like the smart play. It was not. 8 hours later the weather shifted. The burning cycle ended, and the freezing cycle hit, and with it came a storm. Rain turned to ice, turned to a wall of water that poured down the slopes on both sides of the ravine. The dry creek bed at the bottom became a river in minutes. The river became a flood. 3 recruits were nearly swept away. The crest was slammed into a rock wall and cut badly across the chest. Torin was pulled under the current and tumbled through the dark water like a leaf. Danny went in after Torin without thinking, the way he always did, and hauled the small Pelhari out with one arm, while bracing himself against a rock ledge with the other. He pulled them both onto higher ground, but his left arm hit the ledge wrong, and the bones snapped clean. He did not scream. He went very white and very quiet, and held his broken arm against his chest, while water rushed past his legs. Gren stood in the middle of the chaos, with his fists clenched and his mouth open, giving orders that no one could hear over the roar of the flood. The squad was scattered. The supplies were half gone. The Kreth was bleeding. Danny's arm was broken. Torin was shaking so hard that the small Pelhari's beak was clicking like a broken clock. Gren froze. Not physically. His body was still upright, and his legs were still planted. But something behind his eyes locked up. He had led them into this, and he did not know how to lead them out. The cascading failures were too many, too fast, and the warrior's instinct he had been so proud of had no answer for a flood in a ravine at night, with wounded all around him. Katie stepped forward. She did not announce herself. She did not push Gren aside or call him out. She just moved, the way water moves around a stone, naturally and without wasted effort. She went to Danny first. She knelt beside him, examined his arm with quick, steady hands, and splinted it, using a rigid strip she pulled from her own chest armor and a length of cord from her pack. Danny hissed through his teeth once, and then nodded. He was functional. Then she turned to the squad and spoke clearly but calmly. She told the Kreth to apply pressure to the chest wound and stay in the middle of the formation, where the others could protect them. She told Danny to manage the injured from the center, and to call out if anyone showed signs of shock. She told Torin to move to high ground, and use the Pelhari's natural gliding ability to scout the terrain ahead from the ridgeline. She put the Draxari, including Gren, on the outer edges of the formation, where their size and strength could shield the group from whatever came next. She did not ask if anyone had a problem with this. She did not look at Gren for permission. She simply started making decisions, and everyone, including Gren, followed. Over the next 48 hours, Katie led the squad across the island like she had been doing it her whole life. She navigated predator territory by watching the bioluminescent plants that grew along the forest floor. She had read about them in the briefing materials, spending an extra hour on the section while the others slept. The plants glowed brighter when large creatures moved nearby, a natural warning system that most recruits either missed or forgot. Katie used them like a map, steering the squad through gaps in the predator patrol patterns with a patience that made the Draxari restless, but kept everyone alive. She put the Kreth on point for every water crossing, because the amphibious recruit could read currents by feel. She positioned the Draxari as rearguards during rest periods, rotating them in shifts so no one burned out. She gave Torin a purpose that fit perfectly. The small Pelhari glided from ridgeline to ridgeline, and reported back on terrain, drone positions, and weather changes, with a precision that surprised everyone, especially Torin. Danny worked through the pain. His arm was broken and useless, but his voice was calm and his training was solid. He kept the squad's morale steady with quiet words, checked the Kreth's wound every few hours, and once made Torin laugh by describing the time Katie accidentally set fire to a campsite in Idaho because she put a pot of beans too close to the flame and fell asleep. On the second night, A pack of simulated apex predators cornered the squad in a narrow canyon. The creatures were massive, six-legged, covered in dark armored plating, and they hunted by echolocation, sending out pulses of sound and reading the reflections. The squad pressed against the canyon wall. The Draxari raised their weapons. Torin's crest went flat. Katie walked forward, alone. She moved toward the lead predator, the largest one at the front of the pack, and stopped 10 feet away. She stood completely still. She made direct eye contact, though the creature had no visible eyes, fixing her gaze on the sensory ridge along its skull. Then she took a breath and shouted a single sustained note, a low, steady tone that she held for nearly 8 seconds. The predator flinched. The pack behind it scattered sideways, confused and agitated. The lead creature shook its head violently and backed away, and within 30 seconds, the entire pack had disappeared into the canyon shadows. In the monitoring station high above the simulation floor, Vorath was standing. He had been standing for some time. He turned to Commander Vel and said nothing for a long moment. Vel asked him what the human had done. Vorath said she disrupted their echolocation. She matched the resonant frequency of their sensory system and overloaded it. It was in the briefing materials, he said, buried in a technical appendix that no recruit in 40 years had ever read. Katie Bowman had read it. And she used it to face down a pack of apex predators with nothing but her voice. The squad reached the extraction point with 4 hours to spare. Every remaining recruit made it. Danny's arm was properly treated by the medical team the moment they landed. The Kret's wound was sealed. Torin glided down from a high ridge and landed on the platform last, exhausted and trembling, but standing upright with something new in those enormous dark eyes. Katie sat down on the edge of the platform. She reached into her vest, pulled out a ration bar she had somehow kept dry through 3 days of rain and flood and predators and combat, and started eating. Vorath stood at the observation rail and watched her. Then he turned to Commander Vel and said, very quietly, that he was wrong. Vel asked him to be more specific. He said he was wrong about everything. The final weeks of the program were hard, but something had changed, and everyone could feel it. Vorath no longer stood at the front of the room and spoke about the recruits as if they were problems to be solved. He spoke to them like soldiers. He addressed Katie by her last name, without the slight pause he used to put before it. The pause that once carried the unspoken word human, like a label he could not quite swallow. He asked her opinion during tactical planning sessions, and listened when she gave it. He assigned Danny to lead the field medicine modules for the remaining recruits, after watching him treat 3 different species with a broken arm and a calm voice during the crucible. He watched Torin run an aerial reconnaissance drill and nodded once, which from Vorath was the same as a standing ovation. The barracks felt different too. The silence between species that had filled the first weeks was gone. Gren, the big Draxari who had challenged Katie for leadership and then frozen in the flood, was the one who changed the most visibly. He was quieter now, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the sulking silence of wounded pride, but the steady stillness of someone who had learned something important about himself and was still figuring out what to do with it. One evening, a few days before the graduation ceremony, Gren walked over to Katie's bunk. She was sitting cross-legged on the mattress, reading a data tablet as usual, her boots lined up neatly on the floor. Danny was on his bunk across the aisle, his arm out of the splint now, but still stiff, tossing a small rubber ball against the wall and catching it with his good hand. Gren stopped in front of Katie and stood there for a moment. Then he performed the Draxari apology gesture, a slow, deep bow with both fists pressed hard against his chest. Among the Draxari, it was reserved for moments of genuine shame and honest admission, and it was almost never given to someone outside their species. The other Drexari in the barracks went very still. Gren told Katie, in his deep, rolling voice, that she was the finest squad leader he had ever served under. He said his challenge on the first day of the Crucible was born from arrogance and ignorance, and that his shame was honest. He said he would carry the memory of the flood and of her stepping forward when he could not, as a lesson for the rest of his life. Katie looked up from her tablet. She was quiet for a second, and then she told him there was no shame in learning. She said the only shame was in refusing to learn when the lesson was right in front of you, and he had not refused. She said he was a good soldier and a better person than he gave himself credit for. His jaw worked for a moment, and then he gave a short nod and walked back to his bunk. He did not speak again that night, but Danny noticed that the big Drexari sat a little taller after that. Torin came over and sat on the edge of Katie's bunk, something the small Pelhari had started doing weeks ago and now did without thinking about it, and asked if the feeling in the room was what humans called family. Katie thought about it and said it was close enough. The graduation ceremony took place in the Academy's Central Hall, an amphitheater carved into the heart of the station with seating for hundreds. The seats were filled. Officers from a dozen coalition species sat in formal rows, their uniforms sharp and their faces serious. Diplomats and military dignitaries from worlds Katie had never heard of watched from elevated balconies. The lighting was low and warm, and the coalition emblem, a circle of stars around a clasped set of hands from 3 different species, glowed softly on the wall behind the main stage. Out of 12 original recruits, 7 graduated. Katie Bowman, Danny Holt, Torin, Gren, the 2 Kref, 1 other Drexari. They stood in a single line at the front of the hall, wearing clean uniforms and standing as straight as their tired bodies would allow. Vorath walked to the podium. He looked different in his formal uniform, sharper, older somehow. The scar on his face caught the light as he turned to face the audience. He stood there for a moment without speaking, and the hall was perfectly silent. Then he began. He told the audience that for 40 years he had trained the galaxy's finest soldiers. He said he had seen Drexari warriors break stone with their bare hands, and Kretz swimmers cross oceans without surfacing. He said he had watched Pelhari scouts navigate impossible terrain, and species from every corner of the coalition push themselves past limits they did not know they had. He said he believed, after all of that he understood what strength looked like. He paused. He said he was taught something new this cycle. He said it was taught to him by 2 humans from a planet classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, a classification so extreme that most species in the coalition had assumed it was a data error the first time they saw it. He said these 2 humans never once raised their voices during the entire program. They never boasted, they never threatened. They never tried to prove they were superior or demanded respect or challenged anyone to a fight. They simply showed up every morning, prepared themselves quietly, and did what needed to be done. When their equipment failed, they adapted. When the environment tried to kill them, they found a way to live in it. When a teammate was in danger, they went in after them without hesitation. And when they were done surviving whatever the program threw at them, they sat down and ate. Because to a human, survival was not a victory to celebrate. It was just another day. He looked directly at Katie. He said he once told Commander Vel, in front of other recruits, that humans would not endure Deathworld training. He said it with absolute certainty. He said it because he looked at them and saw small, soft creatures with thin skin and short lives, and he could not imagine how such beings could survive what his program demanded. He told the audience that he was profoundly and completely wrong. He said humans did not just endure, they adapted, they persisted. They found food where there was none, warmth where there was only cold, and hope where every tactical model said there should be nothing but despair. And when they were done surviving, they sat down and ate. Because to a human, even the worst day was still just a day, and days were meant to be lived through, not surrendered to. The hall was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of an awkward moment, but the heavy silence of something true, settling into a room full of people who could feel its weight. Katie sat in the front row between Danny and Torin. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was calm. She did not cry or smile or react in any visible way, though Danny could see the small muscle in her jaw tighten the way it did when she was feeling something she did not want to show. She leaned over and whispered to Danny that she was hungry, and asked if he wanted to grab something after this. Danny's mouth twitched into a grin, and he whispered back that he absolutely did. Torin, sitting on Katie's other side, heard them both, and let out a quiet chirping sound that the humans had learned was Pelhari laughter. Commander Lashawn Vell took the podium after Vorath stepped down. Her skin was a pale, soft blue, the color she turned when she was feeling something close to admiration. She addressed the audience in her measured voice and announced that effective immediately, the Galactic Coalition was opening all Deathworld training programs to human applicants. She said the performance data from this cycle would be studied, analyzed, and referenced for decades. She said the Coalition owed a debt of understanding to the 2 human recruits who had shown them all what a Class 12 Deathworld could produce. After the ceremony, Katie and Danny stood in the corridor outside the hall. Torin was with them, along with Gren, who lingered nearby like he was not sure if he was invited, but did not want to leave. Torin told Katie that the Coalition had assigned the small Pelhari to a deep space reconnaissance unit, something Torin had dreamed of since childhood, but never believed was possible. Torin said it was because of them, because Katie taught courage by example, and Danny taught endurance through kindness. Torin's enormous dark eyes were wet, and the feathered crest on the small Pelhari's head stood fully upright for the first time Katie had ever seen, a sign, she had learned, of deep joy. Katie put her hand on Torin's shoulder and told the small Pelhari to go be great. Danny nodded and said Torin had earned every bit of it. Gren stepped forward and offered both humans the Draxari fist-to-chest salute, the one reserved for honored warriors. Then he turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. 1 month later, Katie and Danny were back on Earth. They sat on the tailgate of a pickup truck in Montana, parked at the edge of a dirt road that looked out over a valley full of pine trees and long golden grass. The sun was going down behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that no simulation could ever match. The air was cool and dry, and smelled like dust and wildflowers. Danny's arm was fully healed. He flexed it absently and leaned back on his hands. Katie sat next to him, with her boots hanging off the tailgate and an apple in her hand. She took a bite and chewed slowly, looking at the mountains. She said she kind of missed the ice moon. Danny turned and looked at her with an expression of disbelief. He told her she was absolutely out of her mind. They both laughed, and the sound carried out over the valley and disappeared into the trees. That evening, in his office aboard the Academy station still orbiting Marin 4, Vorath Keen opened the Coalition Species Capability Database. He navigated to the entry for humans. The file had not been updated in years. Under the section for projected training outcomes, the old text still read, "Insufficient data, unlikely to complete program." He deleted it. He sat for a moment, his clawed fingers hovering over the keypad. Then he typed a single line and saved the file. "Do not underestimate them. They will eat your Deathworld for breakfast, and then ask for seconds." He shut off the screen, leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, in a very long time, he smiled. The shuttle docked with a soft clang that echoed through the massive bay of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy. The station hung in orbit around a gas giant called Marin 4, a swirling ball of orange and red storms that filled the viewports like a painted wall. Dozens of alien species moved through the docking bay in organized lines, carrying gear, checking in at processing desks, and glancing nervously at the instructors who stood along the walls like statues made of muscle and bad attitude. Katie Bowman stepped off the human transport shuttle with her duffel bag over one shoulder and a half-eaten protein bar in her right hand. She was 28 years old, average height, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she looked about as dangerous as a librarian on vacation. Behind her came Danny Holt, her squad mate and best friend since their first week of boot camp back on Earth. Danny was tall, a little lanky, with an easy grin and the kind of relaxed walk that made him look like he was heading to a barbecue, instead of the most brutal military training program in the known galaxy. Every alien in the docking bay stopped and stared. It was not the subtle kind of staring. A group of Draxari soldiers, each one standing close to 8 feet tall, with thick green scales and jaws that could crush stone, turned their massive heads in unison. A cluster of Pelhari cadets, small and bird-like with hollow bones and wide dark eyes, whispered to each other in quick chirping voices. Even the Kreth, a pair of amphibious beings who rarely showed interest in anything that was not underwater, blinked their horizontal eyelids slowly. Humans had never been admitted to the Deathworld survival program before. Not once in 40 years. Katie took another bite of her protein bar and kept walking. At the end of the docking bay, standing with his arms crossed and his chin tilted upward, was Instructor Vorath Keen. He was Draxari, and he was the biggest one Katie had ever seen. His scales were dark, almost black, and a long scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw. He had been the senior survival instructor at the academy for 19 years, and in that time he had broken more recruits than most officers had ever trained. Next to him stood Commander Lishan Vel, the academy's overseer. She was Vailani, tall and slender with 4 arms, and skin that shifted between pale silver and soft blue depending on her mood. Right now her skin was a flat neutral gray. She was watching the humans with no expression at all. Vorath did not bother to lower his voice. He turned to Vel and said that allowing these creatures into his program was an insult to every recruit who had earned their place here. He said that humans were soft, short-lived, and fragile. He said their bones broke too easily, their skin tore like wet paper, and their species had no natural weapons worth mentioning. He said, with the certainty of someone who had never been proven wrong, that humans would not endure Deathworld training. He gave them 2 weeks before they quit or collapsed. Katie heard every word. She did not look up. She finished her protein bar, folded the wrapper neatly, and tucked it into her pocket. Then she looked at the nearest processing officer and asked where the barracks were. Danny gave Vorath a polite nod as they passed. Nothing more. Vorath's jaw tightened. He had expected something. Fear, maybe. Anger. Some kind of defensive posture or desperate attempt to prove themselves. Just a woman, finishing a snack, and a man nodding like he was passing a neighbor on the street. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Commander Vel watched the 2 humans disappear down the corridor. She tapped a quiet note into her data tablet and said nothing. The barracks were long, narrow, and cold. Metal bunks lined both walls, 12 in total, 1 for each recruit in the training cycle. The rooms smelled like recycled air and disinfectant. Katie and Danny took the 2 corner bunks at the far end, because nobody else wanted them. The corner was near a ventilation duct that hummed constantly, and the overhead light flickered every few minutes. Katie dropped her bag on the mattress, sat down, and started organizing her gear. Danny did the same across from her, whistling something off-key. Over the next hour, the rest of the squad filtered in. 4 Draxari soldiers entered first, each one massive and radiating confidence. They took the center bunks without asking, and began unpacking weapons maintenance kits and thick training manuals. Behind them came two Kreth, wet-skinned and quiet, who chose bunks near the water access panel without speaking to anyone. Then came three Pelhari cadets, nervous and quick-moving, their feathered crests flattened against their heads, and what Katie had read was a sign of anxiety. The last Pelhari to enter was the smallest of the group. Torin was barely 4 feet tall, with delicate bones and enormous dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Torin looked around the barracks, saw that the only remaining bunk was next to Katie, and walked over slowly. Katie glanced up and gave a small nod. Torin settled onto the bunk with careful bird-like movements, and sat there for a long moment in silence. Then, in a quiet voice that clicked slightly on certain sounds, Torin asked Katie if she was frightened. She said she had been through worse. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a strip of beef jerky and held it out toward Torin. Torin looked at the jerky with wide eyes, politely declined, but managed what might have been a small smile. Danny leaned over from his bunk and told Torin not to worry about Katie. He said she once got lost in a blizzard in Wyoming for 3 days, and came back with nothing but a bad mood because she missed a football game. He said if anyone was going to be fined here, it was her. Torin looked between the two humans and seemed to relax just a little. That night, after the lights dimmed and the barracks settled into the restless silence of 12 strangers trying to sleep in the same room, Vorath sat alone in his office on the upper level of the academy. The room was sparse: a desk, a chair, a single lamp, and a screen built into the wall. He pulled up the recruit files one by one. He reviewed the Draxari candidates with satisfaction. He noted the Kreth with cautious approval. He skimmed the Pelhari with low expectations. Then he opened the human files. The profiles were simple. Katie Bowman, combat survival specialist. Danny Holt, field medic and tactical support. Both from Earth, both volunteers. Nothing remarkable on paper. But at the bottom of each file, in a small line of text he had never paid attention to before, was their homeworld classification. Earth, Class 12 Deathworld. Vorath stopped scrolling. He read it again. Class 12. The training program had never accepted recruits from anything above a Class 7. Most species that evolved on anything above Class 9 did not develop civilization at all. They either died out or became something too dangerous to contact. Humans came from a Class 12, and they built cities, wrote music, and wrapped their food in little plastic packages. Vorath stared at the screen for a long time. Then he told himself it had to be a clerical error, some bureaucratic mistake in the database. There was no way those two soft, quiet, snack-eating creatures in the corner bunks came from one of the most hostile planets ever catalogued. He shut off the screen and went to bed.